The check was for $400. It was printed on heavy cream paper with the Vantage Capital logo embossed at the top, and it was handed to a man standing on the porch of a house he had lived in for 11 years with the particular efficiency of someone completing a minor transaction before lunch. The man looked at the check. He looked at the number. He looked at the man who had handed it to him, Marcus Hale, Senior Acquisitions Director for Vantage Capital, who was wearing a suit that, cost more than the check, and standing on the porch with the particular posture of a man who had already moved on from this conversation in his mind and was simply waiting for his body to follow. The single dad folded the check along a clean crease and placed it in the front pocket of his flannel shirt. He said thank you. He picked up the box of his daughter's things from beside the door. He took her hand. He walked to his truck. Marcus Hale watched them go and then turned to his associate and said they could begin the survey Monday. 18 months later, Marcus Hale was sitting in a federal deposition room answering questions about that $400 check because the land beneath the house he had purchased for less than the cost of a decent dinner was sitting on a verified crude oil reserve valued at $200 million. And the man who had signed the check had known. The man who had received it, the single dad in the flannel shirt with his daughter's hand in his, had known too. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to say so. The town of Harlan Falls sat in the kind of geography that looks unremarkable until you understand what it is sitting on. Flat in most directions, with a low ridge running east to west along its northern edge that most people who drove through the town noticed only as a slight change in the road grade. The soil was clay-heavy and difficult in the wet months. The land did not look like land that held secrets. It looked like, land that had simply been there for a long time, accumulating the quiet of a place nobody had looked at carefully enough. Calvin Marsh had grown up on the eastern edge of Harlan Falls, in the house his grandfather had built on 14 acres that had been in the family since before Calvin's father was born. The house was modest and well-maintained in the way that things are maintained when a person tending them understands that what they cannot afford to replace they must keep working. Calvin, was 39 years old. He had a daughter named Rosie who was 7, with her mother's red hair and her father's particular stillness, the quality of a child who listened to everything and commented on selected portions, and whose selections were always more accurate than they had any right to be. She had a stuffed fox named Copper who sat on the corner of Calvin's workbench in the barn during school hours, positioned facing the door. Calvin had worked the 14 acres the way his, grandfather had worked them, not as a commercial farm, not as a development property, but as a functional piece of land that supported a life rather than generating a profit. He kept a modest vegetable garden. He maintained the barn. He repaired what broke and replaced nothing until replacement was the only remaining option. He had a part-time position at the county road department, operating heavy equipment 3 days a week, which covered the property taxes and the utilities, and left enough to put something away each month in an account he did not think about often, because thinking about it too much was a way of needing it to be more than it was. What most people in Harlan Falls did not know about Calvin Marsh was what he had done for the 7 years before Rosie was born, and the 4 years before he came back to his grandfather's land. He had worked as a field geologist for an independent petroleum survey company called Meridian Subsurface, operating across 6 states in the central and southern regions. He had spent those years reading the earth the way certain people read text, not for surface information, but for what the structure underneath implied. He had a master's degree in geological engineering from the University of Oklahoma. He had filed 11 independent geological assessments during his time at Meridian, 7 of which had preceded confirmed reserve discoveries within the boundaries he had identified. 7 out of 11. In petroleum geology that, was not a career statistic. That was a gift. He had left Meridian when his wife Clara had died a highway accident on a survey trip. A Tuesday morning, a call that reached him in a field in eastern Oklahoma while he was reading a core sample. He had driven home without stopping. He had buried Clara in the churchyard at Harlan Falls beside his grandparents. He had taken Rosie from Clara's mother's arms and carried her to the house on the 14 acres and not left again. He had not worked in, petroleum geology since. He had not forgotten a single thing he knew. The geological survey of the northern Harlan Falls Basin had been commissioned by Vantage Capital 18 months before they arrived at Calvin's door. Vantage Capital was a private equity firm based in Chicago, led by a man named Richard Kane, 61 years old. silver-haired, with the particular confidence of someone who had been right about large things often enough to have stopped distinguishing carefully between, or confidence and certainty. The survey had been conducted by a contracted geological team who had spent 6 weeks in the region and produced a report that was accurate in its surface findings and incomplete in its subsurface analysis. The report identified potential hydrocarbon indicators in the basin, but rated the probability of a commercially viable reserve as moderate, a classification that in the industry meant promising enough to pursue but not so certain as to drive up land acquisition, or prices prematurely. Richard Kane had read the report twice. He had then authorized Marcus Hale to begin a quiet acquisition program purchasing as much of the Northern Basin land as possible before any public indication of the survey's findings could influence market prices. The program had been structured carefully. Properties were acquired through a series of shell companies, each transaction recorded under a different entity name. Prices were kept low by approaching landowners individually, or without public process, under cover of agricultural development interest. Marcus Hale had been doing this for 4 months when he arrived at Calvin Marsh's door. He had offered $400 for 14 acres. Calvin had looked at the check. He had said thank you. He had picked up the box in his daughter's hand and walked to his truck. What Marcus Hale did not know, what Richard Kane did not know, was what Calvin had done in the 6 weeks after he received the survey crews, or notification that they were operating in the Northern Basin. He had gone out to his land, not the way a farmer goes out to check his fields, the way a geologist goes out to read a formation. He had spent 4 days walking the 14 acres and the adjacent parcels, taking surface readings, examining outcrop patterns along the eastern ridge, collecting soil samples at 14 specific points that he had identified from the geological survey data he had quietly obtained through a former, or colleague at Meridian. He had taken his samples to a private laboratory in a city 2 hours away. He had paid for the analysis himself, with money from the account he did not think about often. The results had come back in 3 weeks. He had read them at the kitchen table after Rosie was asleep. He had sat with them for a long time. The formation beneath the eastern portion of his 14 acres, and, by structural extension, beneath a significant portion of the adjacent parcels that were, or being quietly acquired, was not a moderate probability hydrocarbon indicator. It was a verified subsurface trap structure with all 4 geological prerequisites for a commercially viable crude oil reserve. Calvin had known this before Marcus Hale knocked on his door. He had known it when he looked at the check. He had folded it and said thank you because he was not yet ready. The house Calvin moved into after selling the 14 acres was a rental on the west side of Harlan Falls, a small, or 2-bedroom with a yard that needed attention and a kitchen that was functional in the way that kitchens are functional when no one has loved them for a while. Calvin loved it in about 3 weeks. He fixed the back fence. He repaired the kitchen faucet. He planted a small garden along the south wall. Nothing ambitious, just tomatoes and 2 rows of herbs that Rosie had requested specifically and tended with the focused dedication of a 7-year-old who had decided that growing things was a serious responsibility. Copper sat on the corner of a workbench Calvin built in the garage, facing the door. Rosie did not ask many questions about the old house. She asked one, on the second night in the new place, sitting on the edge of her bed with Copper in her lap, and the particular directness of a child who had decided she was old enough for an honest answer. She asked if they had to leave. Calvin sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He said they had made a trade, she said. Did we get, or something good for it, he said. Not yet. But we will. She considered this with the judicial seriousness she brought to all questions of fairness. Then she said okay and put Copper on the pillow and went to sleep. Calvin sat in the kitchen for 2 more hours after that, not at the table but at the small desk he had set up in the corner, the one that held his geological notebooks, his survey maps, his laboratory results, and the legal pad on which he was, with the patience of a man who had spent, 7 years reading formations that took millions of years to develop, building something that could not be rushed. The person Calvin called was a woman named Elena Voss. Elena was 44 years old, a petroleum rights attorney based in Oklahoma City who had spent 20 years working on the intersection of geological assessment and land acquisition law, specifically on cases where the two had been deliberately misaligned. Calvin had known her since his Meridian years. She had advised our company on 2 contested survey disputes, and he had sat across a conference table from her on both occasions and watched her take apart opposing geological assessments with the methodical precision of someone someone who had learned the science in order to understand the law, and had ended up understanding both better than most people understood either. She had remembered his name when he called. She had listened to the full account without interrupting, asking 2 questions and writing both answers, or down before he had finished the sentence. When he was done, she said one thing. She said, "Calvin, you need to tell me you documented everything before you signed that check." He said he had, she said. Soil samples, lab results, formation maps, timeline of the survey crew's activity, date of the acquisition offer, date you received your own results. He said yes to each one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When did you know?" He said he had read the survey crew's equipment signatures or entry points from public county access records and understood the geological implication within the first week of their presence in the basin. Elena was quiet again. Then she said, "You sold them the land after you had your own results." He said yes, she said. "Why?" He said because he needed them to complete the acquisition program first. He said that what he had found beneath his 14 acres extended structurally beneath the adjacent parcels as well. He said that if he had contested the acquisition or made his findings public before Vantage had completed their program, they would have abandoned the effort, restructured through different entities, and returned in a different form. He said he needed them to own all of it before he could address all of it. Elena was quiet for a long time. Then she said she needed him to send her everything. He said it was already in an envelope. She said she would call him in 4 days. What Elena found when she reviewed the documentation was not a single violation but a pattern, a series of connected decisions that, assembled in sequence, constituted something the law had a specific and serious name for. The geological survey report commissioned by Vantage had been produced by a contracted team whose findings had been selectively presented in the internal memo that authorized the acquisition program. The moderate probability classification that had been used to justify the low acquisition prices was not the conclusion the geological team had reached. It was the conclusion that had been forwarded to the acquisition team. The geological team's full report, obtained by Elena through a discovery request on a related prior matter, had used different language. It had described the northern Harlan Falls Basin as a high-probability subsurface structure with indicators consistent with commercial reserve potential. Someone had changed moderate to high before the report reached the acquisition team, or, more precisely, someone had, ensured the acquisition team received a version of the report that served the acquisition strategy rather than accurately represented the geological findings. That someone was not difficult to identify once you knew where to look. Elena filed the initial complaint with the State Land Rights Commission on a Wednesday morning. She filed the Federal Securities Disclosure complaint on Thursday. She did not tell Calvin the specific timing. She told him to take Rosie to school as normal and to call her at noon. He took Rosie to school. He called at noon. Elena told him it had begun. Richard Kane received the first notification on a Friday. It came through his general counsel's office and was described initially as a routine land rights inquiry from a state commission. His counsel flagged it as low priority. Richard had 3 other matters of greater immediate significance and did not read the full filing until Sunday evening. He read it twice. Then he called Marcus Hale. The call lasted 11 minutes. Afterward, Richard sat in his home office with the filing on his desk and the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that a situation he believed was closed is in fact only beginning. He pulled the original geological survey report from the acquisition file. He read the moderate probability classification. He thought about the 14 acres, the $400 check, the man in the flannel shirt who had said thank you and walked to his truck. He thought, about the fact that a man who accepted $400 for 14 acres without argument, without negotiation, without a single question about the survey activity on his land in a region where survey crews had been operating for 6 weeks, was either the least curious landowner in Harlan Falls or someone who already had better information than the check implied. He thought about which of those 2 things was more likely. He called his counsel back. He asked one question. He asked who, had sold them the land on the eastern parcel. His counsel gave him the name. He asked for the full background on the name. His counsel said he would have it by morning. The morning briefing on Calvin Marsh arrived at 7:15. Richard read it at his desk with a cup of coffee that went cold before he reached the second page. Master's degree in geological engineering, 7 years at Meridian Subsurface, 11 independent assessments, 7 confirmed reserves, He set the briefing down. He looked at, or his window. Outside, the Chicago skyline presented itself with the particular indifference of a city that did not concern itself with the specific dimensions of anyone's mistake. Richard thought about a man who had spent 7 years reading formations that took millions of years to develop and had spent 18 months reading one specific formation on 14 specific acres, and had accepted $400 for it. Not because he didn't know what it was worth, because he was waiting. Or Richard called his counsel and said 4 words. He said, "Find out what's coming." What was coming had been in preparation for 16 months. Elena had spent that time building a case with the methodical patience of someone who had learned from Calvin, though she would not have described it that way, that precision mattered more than speed, and that a structure built correctly did not need to be rushed. The core of the case was straightforward. Calvin Marsh had been offered $400, or for 14 acres based on a materially misrepresented geological assessment. The assessment used in the acquisition offer had classified the land's subsurface potential as moderate. The full geological report on which that classification was based had described the potential as high. The difference between those two words, in the context of a structured land acquisition program designed to suppress prices before reserve confirmation, was the difference between a transaction and a fraud. Or case had 3 components. The first was the land rights claim, a petition for rescission of the original transaction on grounds of material misrepresentation, which would require Vantage to return the land or pay fair market value at the time of the confirmed reserve discovery. The second was the securities complaint, a federal filing citing the misrepresentation of geological findings in the context of an investment-structured acquisition program, which implicated not just the transaction, but the program's entire financial architecture. The third was the one Calvin had asked Elena to include and which she had initially questioned, and then, upon review of the documentation, agreed was not only legally supportable but potentially the strongest component of all. It was a claim against the Geological Survey Company for the selective presentation of their findings, a professional liability action that named the specific modification to the report and identified the point in the document chain where the language had changed. Calvin had found it. He had found it because he had obtained the original field notes from the survey crew through a former colleague at Meridian, who knew the lead surveyor and had, at Calvin's quiet request, asked a few questions over a shared meal. The field notes described the formation in language consistent with high probability. The submitted report did not. Someone had made a decision between the field and the filing cabinet. Elena had found, who? Marcus Hale resigned from Vantage Capital on a Tuesday. He submitted his resignation by email, citing personal reasons, with 2 weeks' notice that he did not serve. He left the building with a box and the particular expression of a man who has run the numbers and understood that the numbers are not running in his direction. Richard Kane did not resign. He retained counsel and prepared for the federal process with the focused efficiency of a man who had navigated significant legal exposure. Before and understood that the outcome was not yet determined. He was correct that it was not yet determined. He was less correct about what determined it. The deposition was held on a Wednesday in a federal building 40 miles from Harlan Falls. Calvin arrived alone. Elena was beside him. He wore a dark jacket and clean boots and carried nothing in his hands. Richard Kane was across the table with 3 attorneys arranged beside him and the composed expression of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms designed to produce pressure and had learned to sit inside that pressure without showing its effect. He looked at Calvin Marsh for the first time since the acquisition. Calvin looked back, not with hostility, not with the performed patience of someone waiting to land a blow, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, direct, without a performance layer between himself and the thing he was looking at. Richard recognized something in that quality. He had, seen it in the briefing document, the geological record, 7 out of 11. He was looking at someone who had read the land beneath his grandfather's house the way Richard read balance sheets, not as a surface, but as a structure. Someone who had known what he was sitting on before any survey crew arrived and had waited, with the particular patience of a man who understood that formations do not move, for the moment when the knowledge would be most precisely applied. Richard looked at the table. The deposition began. The settlement was reached in the 11th week. It was not the outcome Richard had anticipated when he retained his 3 attorneys. It was the outcome that became inevitable once the modified geological report had been entered into evidence, and the chain of documentation Calvin had assembled over 16 months had been reviewed by the federal examiner. The settlement had 4 components. The first was the return of the 14 acres to Calvin Marsh, with full, or clear title and no encumbrances. The second was a compensatory payment for the 18 months of displacement, the rental costs. And what Elena had argued successfully was the demonstrable economic loss from a transaction conducted under fraudulent misrepresentation. The third was a licensing agreement. The oil reserve beneath the 14 acres extended, as Calvin had always known, beneath the adjacent parcels that Vantage had acquired through the same program. Those parcels remained in Vantage's portfolio. Extracting the reserve required access to the geological formation from multiple entry points. The most efficient and legally cleanest path to that access ran through Calvin's land. Vantage needed him. Not in the way that Evelyn Cross had needed Mason Holt urgently, in a crisis with no alternative. In the way that a company that had spent 2 years and significant capital acquiring reserve realizes that the person they acquired it from still holds the key they didn't, or account for. The licensing agreement gave Calvin a royalty position on all extraction activity from the formation, a percentage interest in the reserve's production, structured over the life of the well. $200 million was the reserve's verified value. A royalty position in a $200 million reserve was not a settlement, it was a future. The fourth component was the simplest and, in the way that simple things sometimes are, the most significant. It was a formal, or acknowledgement drafted by Vantage's own counsel at Elena's insistence that the original transaction had been conducted on the basis of materially misrepresented geological information, and that the $400 acquisition price had not reflected the actual assessed value of the land at the time of sale. It was 4 sentences. Calvin read them at Elena's office table. He read them slowly, the way he read everything that carried weight. Then he placed the document on the table, or smoothed it once along the crease and said it was acceptable. Elena looked at him. She asked if he wanted to take a moment. He said he was fine. She asked how he felt. He thought about this with the genuine consideration it deserved. He said he felt the way he felt after a core sample came back confirming what the surface had been saying for weeks. He said it was not surprise, it was completion. He said the land had always been what it was. It had just taken the right sequence of events for everyone to read it the same way. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she said he was the strangest client she had ever had. He said he took that as a compliment. She said she intended it as one. The house on the 14 acres needed work. 18 months of vacancy had done what vacancy does, softened the gutters, encouraged a particular vine along the south wall, allowed the barn door's lower hinge to develop the specific complaint of a hinge that has been ignored through 1-2. Many wet seasons. Calvin assessed it the way he assessed everything, not with the emotional weight of return, but with the practical attention of someone who knew what needed to be done and had decided to begin. He started with the barn door. Rosie stood in the yard with copper under one arm, watching her father work with the focused attention she had applied to this activity since she was old enough to understand that watching her father work was different from watching most people work that. His hands moved with a particular knowledge that came from understanding not just the surface of a problem but the structure underneath it. She said, "Dad, are we really back?" He set down the wrench. He turned to look at her, not at the property, not at the work remaining, but at her face. He said, "We're really back." She looked at the house. She looked at the barn. She looked at the garden along the south wall where nothing had grown for 18 months. She said, "Can we plant the tomatoes?" Again? He said, "First thing Saturday." She said, "Okay." She went to the porch and put Copper on the top step facing the yard, in the position he had always occupied on warm days when Rosie was outside witness to whatever was happening, Copper's job being simply to be present and face the right direction. Calvin turned back to the barn door. The hinge gave on the third adjustment. The door swung clean and level. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then he moved to the next item on the list. Elena called that evening. She said the licensing paperwork would be finalized by the end of the month. She said the first royalty payment would follow within 60 days of the extraction agreement's effective date. She said there were 2 additional matters she needed him to review, but that they could wait until next week. He said that was fine. She said one other thing. She said she had been practicing law for 20 years and that she had taken Calvin's case because she knew his geological record and had trusted his assessment of the formation. She said she had not, at the time he first called, fully understood the patience required for what he was describing. She said, "You sold that land knowing what was under it." He said, "Yes," she said. "And you waited 16 months. He said yes, she said. Most people couldn't do that. Calvin looked out the kitchen window at the yard where Rosie had been, now empty in the evening light, Copper still on the porch step facing the garden. He said, most people haven't spent 7 years waiting for formations that took 100 million years to develop, he said. 16 months is nothing. He said it without bitterness and without pride. The way a person states a fact about themselves that they have long since stopped needing anyone else to understand. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said goodnight. He said goodnight. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call, not reviewing documents, not planning the next sequence, or simply sitting in the house that his grandfather had built on 14 acres that had always held what they held, quietly and without announcement, waiting for the person who knew how to read them. The light in the kitchen was warm. The barn door was level. Outside, Copper faced the garden where the tomatoes would go on Saturday.